And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue looking at pseudocode, let's go ahead and see how this can be used effectively within a little bit of our program design. So as we look at another pseudocode example, we're going to go ahead and take a look at another problem to go ahead and see how can we generate pseudocode for it. So let's say we have a program that wants to get input from the user to determine if a number is odd or even. If anything entered is not a valid input, the program should give an appropriate error message. So let's go ahead and prepare that scenario for some pseudocode. If we break our program apart into chunks, and then we can apply the appropriate pseudocode. So we have to get user input. We've determined if a number is odd or even. We probably should display a message determining whether it's odd or even. And if an input is invalid, we're going to display some kind of error message. So let's look at this through the lens of pseudocode. As pseudocode, our program might look something like this. Get user input. If num mod 2 equals 0, that will determine if it's even. Display message. Also, if num mod 2 does not equal 0, we're going to be odd. Display a message. Else, that's going to be our invalid input because if it's not odd or even, it's going to display out that way. Now, again, this may not have every scenario, but this is going to be a good start for our pseudocode for us to work with. So the thing we got to think about is, how do we know our program is going to behave as expected? Well, we can use what's known as assertion statements to verify that our program works as intended. An assertion statement is a statement that simply tells something about the state of your program. Assertions must be a statement that evaluates either to true or false and should be providing that there's no mistakes in your program. So if everything is the way it's supposed to be and you do these assertion checks, they're great ways for you to verify that certain values are certain ways. An easy way, of course, that we can do this just to start is by using comments within our code. So for example, I have some sample code here. If n is 0 and sum is 0, I'm going to say, well, I want to verify that n equals 0 and sum equals 0. While n is less than 100, we're going to increment, take n, add it to sum. It's going to go 1, 2, 3 all the way up to n. And by the end of that loop, we could have, like, for example, a print line statement that would output sum. So how do we use these assertion statements in Java? Well, Java actually has a special statement to check whether an assertion is true. Instead of relying on comments and guesswork and stuff like that, we can say assert and then have a Boolean expression that's going to determine that true or false for us. If you run your program with an assertion statement in it, one of the following will occur. If the assertion check is true, well, nothing's going to happen and your program will run as normal. If that assertion check, though, is false, the program's going to end, output an error message, and say that the assertion has failed. So if we look at that code again, we can do that same thing that we had, except instead of comments, we can insert an assertion check in here. So assert n equals 0 and sum equals 0. And we can, of course, check to see if those values are truly going to evaluate to be true, which means it would expect it to be 0 and expect it to be false. Now, you can, of course, put assertion checks at any point in your program, but right here is, of course, just an initialization just for an example. So one thing you might notice is like there's a difference between an assertion check versus just an assertion comment, where you're asserting that certain values have certain meaning. We didn't also convert all of our comments over into assertions because not all comments can be written as assertion checks. The other two comments in the code aren't easily written as a Boolean expression. And while it's not impossible to do so, it's far more complicated than the code that we need to be checking. So how do we actually add assertion statements? So if we look at our existing pseudocode, we can add assertion statements into it. So we're going to convert this over into actual code. So I have scanner kb equals new scanner system in num equals kb.nextInt. I can assert that num mod 2 is either going to equal 0 or num mod 2 is not going to equal 0. And therefore I can evaluate either as even or odd, and I can have my else statement. And you notice the assertion check is only happening after I obtained this value for num from the user. Now over here in Eclipse, I can of course go ahead and have this program in here. And if I just run my program as is, and let's say I enter in a value like 5, you'll see it just spits out odd. If I enter in a invalid number, let's say A, you'll see we get our exception mismatch thrown. So we have a error here, which means we need to, of course, we'd have to revisit how we're handling this input. So let's just go ahead and clear this out. And first off, look at this assertion statement, because one of the things that this should check to see is if this value is actually something that we want to handle. So if we look at this, there's nothing here that's actually handling this correctly to actually display what that assertion would be. Because, for example, if I put something that would, let's say if we put in 0, all right, it comes back as even, even though 0 is technically not even, but it's because of how we're doing our assertion check. And if we actually want to see this assertion check work, let's just go ahead and add another assertion statement here. So let's just say assert num equals 0. And so we can actually check to see if it is 0. And so if I go ahead and run this now, and let's say put 5 in here, you'll see it just jumps right to odd, which means it never actually checked this because this statement is not here. And that's because if you're using something like Eclipse, you might actually have to enable in your IDE that particular thing. So here in Eclipse, we do that by going to run configurations, and we're going to go to arguments here. And we can do this by each individual project. You can, of course, do it for the entire Eclipse, but I'm just going to do it for this project. And in the VM arguments, I'm going to add -EA, and that's going to pretty much force it to run assertion checks. And so I can click run, and it's going to be running now. So if I put in, let's say 0, you'll see it runs as normal because it's passing that first assertion check. It technically will pass the second one as well. But if I come back in here and run it again, and I type in 5, you'll see we get an exception that says assertion error because 5 is not equal to 0. And so that's just a real quick way for you to verify those values are what you expect. Now, of course, this program may not do everything we need to be, and that's okay because that's not the objective of what we're trying to do here. We're simply trying to show that you can use pseudocode to develop these program designs and also look at different ways we can start adding these things like assertion checks to make sure we're getting the values that we're expecting to see in here.